I'm Meredith Vance, 52, and I spent 30 years rising through the United States Army from a quiet ROTC lieutenant to a 3-star general, most of it doing work I could never explain at a dinner table. For decades, I let my own family believe I was a clerk in a basement because being underestimated was easier than the argument. But when a young Marine backhanded me down the Pentagon steps on the morning I came to earn my 4th star, and a 3-star general caught my arm in front of everyone, the story my family had told about me for 30 years finally came apart. Have you ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to know you best? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand quietly in the truth after being written off, hit that like button and subscribe. It was the winter of 1985, and I was 11 years old, lying on my back under our family station wagon in a cold Ohio driveway, feeling for the wire that had come loose behind the radio. My hands were black to the wrist. Inside the house, my little brother Preston was 7, and standing on a kitchen chair, reciting a poem for a school assembly while my parents clapped. I could hear them through the screen door. I found the wire, twisted it back into place, and the radio came on with a burst of static and then music. Nobody came outside to see. I lay there a moment longer than I needed to, listening to the applause that was not for me, and I decided it did not matter. In our house, being useful and being seen were 2 different jobs, and somehow I only ever got hired for the first one. That is the earliest thing I remember clearly about my family, and it turned out to be the whole shape of us. Preston was the one everyone bet on. He was charming in the way that makes teachers forgive late homework and makes relatives slip you $20 at holidays. I was the quiet one who fixed things. When the furnace died, I read the manual. When the taxes confused my father, I sorted the receipts. When the neighbor's boy needed help with his math, I was the one sent over. I was not resentful about it back then. I was good at those jobs, and being good at something is its own kind of warmth when you are a child who does not get much of the other kind. My mother used to say that Preston had the personality and I had the sense. And she said it like she was dividing a pie fairly, 1 slice each, but personality gets noticed at a dinner table and sense gets sent to the garage. By the time I was in high school, I had stopped waiting to be noticed for the things I did well. I ran the school's audiovisual room, I rebuilt a lawnmower engine on the kitchen table over one Christmas break, and I graduated near the top of my class. And the family remembered exactly none of it, because the same December that I fixed the mower, Preston had a solo in the winter concert, and that was the story that got told for years. I joined the Army at 22, in 1996, straight out of college on a commission through the Reserve Officer Program. I came home for 2 days in my new uniform before I reported, and my father looked at me for a long moment and said he was proud, though he said it the way he said most tender things, which was almost silently and then quickly about something else. Preston, 18 and about to start his first year of business school, laughed at my pay. He said $22,000 a year to get yelled at was a genius career move. I let it go. Letting things go was already my native language. The years after that are a blur of airfields and briefing rooms and time zones. I went into intelligence and operations, the parts of the Army that do not make good stories at parties because you cannot tell most of them. I made captain by 2003 and deployed for the first time to a place I still cannot name in casual company. I was good at the work in a way that frightened me a little, because it turned out that the same quiet, watchful, fix the thing in front of me nature that made me invisible at family dinners made me very effective in rooms where lives depended on someone staying calm and seeing clearly. I made major by 2008. Somewhere in there, Preston married a kind, careful woman named Danielle Hart. And I missed the wedding because I was 8,000 miles away in a place where the phones did not work the way phones are supposed to. I sent a gift and a long letter that I wrote by hand in a plywood room at 3 a.m. What the family remembered was the empty chair. That was the year, 2008, that they quietly decided I had chosen work over them, and it became a fact about me that no one ever bothered to check again. Nobody asked what I had been doing that week. If they had, I could not have told them, and somehow that made it worse. Because a secret looks exactly like an excuse from the outside. I learned early that the people who love you can also be the people who most need you to stay small. It is not cruelty, exactly. It is comfort. If I stayed the daughter who did something vague with computers for the government, then no one had to feel behind, no one had to wonder what they had missed, and the family story stayed simple. So I stopped correcting it. When Preston introduced me at parties as his sister, who filed reports in a basement in Virginia and could not talk about her job, I would smile and let it be true enough. Correcting people, I told myself, is a way of needing them to be wrong. And I was tired of needing anything from any of them. Years later, a young captain named Renata Diaz, who became my aide and one of the few people who ever really saw me, asked me why I never set the record straight with my own family. I gave her the honest answer, which was that the record and my need for them to respect it were the same rope, and I had spent my whole life trying to put that rope down. She did not fully understand it then. She would, eventually. So would I. But in 1996, and for a long time after, I simply went to work, did the thing in front of me, and let the people who loved me keep a smaller version of me on a shelf where they could reach it without stretching. There was a night in 2004 that I never told anyone about, least of all my family. I was a captain then, and a decision landed on my desk at 2 a.m. that a more cautious officer would have kicked upstairs and let someone else own. I did not kick it upstairs. I read the situation the way I had read that car radio at 11, patiently, from underneath, until I found the one loose wire everyone else had missed, and I made the call, and it was the right call, and people who had families came home because of it. There was no ceremony for that. There was no phone call to Ohio. I drove back to my quarters at dawn and slept for 4 hours and went back to work, and the only record of it that mattered was in the eyes of the people who had been in the room. That was the year I stopped needing the ceremony. The room was enough. I told myself the room was enough for a very long time. By the middle of the 2000s, I had stopped expecting the shelf to change, and I had made a strange peace with it. The Army saw me clearly, and that was enough. When I did something well, someone whose respect I had earned would look me in the eye and say so, and I learned to live on that instead of on the warmth of the family table. I did not yet know how much the arrangement was costing me, or that it would take a young Marine and a set of stone steps to finally show me the bill. I thought I had made a good trade. I thought quiet was free. It is the most expensive thing I have ever bought. The dismissal did not stay still. Over the next decade, it hardened from teasing into something more organized, and the strange part was that it hardened just as Preston moved closer to my actual world without ever entering it. He left the failing businesses behind and reinvented himself as a defense contractor, the kind who sits in conference rooms, selling software to the same military I served in. And here's the thing about my brother becoming an expert on the military. It made my real career something he could no longer afford to acknowledge. If I was who I actually was, then he was a salesman explaining my own house to me, and that was a mirror he would not look into. At Thanksgiving in 2015, he held court at the table about how the Pentagon really worked. He explained the chain of command to a table that included me. He talked about acquisition timelines and interagency friction and the way real decisions got made, and he did it with the confidence of a man who has been in the building 3 times for meetings that ran 90 minutes each. When he got a detail wrong, a genuine one about how operational authority actually flows during a crisis, I corrected him gently. The way you would hand someone a napkin they had dropped. He waved me off without looking. He told the table that his sister filed reports in a basement in Virginia while he sat in the actual meetings. Everyone laughed warmly, the way families laugh at a bit they have all heard before. I passed the potatoes and I said nothing, because by then saying something felt like begging. Danielle caught me in the kitchen afterward, drying dishes I had insisted on washing. She was the only one who ever seemed to sense there was more to me than the family script allowed. She told me her husband meant well. I told her I knew, and that knowing it was the hard part, because it is easier to forgive someone who is trying to hurt you than someone who is simply, comfortably certain you are less than you are. She looked at me for a second, like she wanted to ask a real question. Then Preston called her name from the other room and she went, and the moment closed like a door. In 2019, I pinned on my first star. I became a brigadier general at 45 years old, which is not a thing that happens to people who file reports in basements. It happens to people who have spent decades making the right call in the wrong hour, over and over, until the institution decides it needs them near the top. I told no one in my family. The only person who congratulated me was Renata, then a lieutenant, who found me in a hallway and shook my hand with tears in her eyes because she understood exactly what it meant. That night I drove home to an apartment where no one knew to ask how my day had been. and I sat with a star in a small box and felt, underneath the pride, a loneliness I did not have a word for. Disrespect rarely arrives as a slammed door. It arrives as 100 small edits to who you are allowed to be. I watched the edits get inherited. At a birthday party that year, Preston's teenage kids, repeating what they had absorbed their whole lives, asked me if it was true I had a boring desk job. They were not being unkind, they were being taught. I nodded and said something light and changed the subject, but a cold thing turned over in my chest, because the false story about me was now 2 generations deep and growing, and children do not question the shape of the world they are handed. They inherit it and pass it on. Preston had a line he used at gatherings when the conversation turned to the military and he wanted to sound wise. He would say that real operators do not make general, they make legends, and paper pushers make general. He would say it while looking at me, and everyone would chuckle, and I would think about the men and women whose names I could not say, the ones who came home because of decisions I made in rooms he would never be cleared to enter, and I would say nothing at all. I would think about a young sergeant I had pulled out of a very bad situation by refusing to accept a plan everyone else had already signed off on, and how his mother had written me a letter I kept in a drawer, and how my own brother would have bet his house that I had never done anything harder than reset a password. There was a 4th of July, 2021, when I came the closest I ever came to breaking the arrangement. Preston was on the back porch telling a story about a general he had met at a conference, a 2-star, and how the man had shaken his hand and remembered his name. He told it the way you tell a story about being admitted somewhere exclusive. And I stood in the doorway with a plate in my hand, holding 2 stars of my own that not one person on that porch knew about. And I felt the sentence rise up in me, the whole true sentence, ready to be said. I could have ended 30 years of it right there in one breath. Instead, I set my plate down and went inside and washed a pan that did not need washing, and I ran the water hot until my hands hurt, and the moment passed. I have thought about that porch many times since. I did not stay quiet that day to protect them. I stayed quiet to protect the arrangement, because the arrangement was the only version of my family I knew how to have, and I was afraid of what we might be without it. Once, late at night, I typed a text to my brother that said only, "You have no idea." I looked at it for a long time, then I deleted it, because sending it would have made his ignorance my problem, and I had spent 30 years refusing to make it mine. I put the phone down and went to sleep, and in the morning I went back to a job that knew exactly who I was. That was the arrangement, and I told myself it was fine, and mostly I believed it. It held right up until a Tuesday morning in the spring of 2026, on the steps of the building my brother liked to explain to me. The recall came quietly, the way the most important orders always do. I was to report to Washington to be confirmed for a 4-star post, a seat at the very top of the Army, the kind of assignment that ends up in history before it ends up in the news. I had 3 stars on my shoulders by then, and a 4th waiting in a box. And when the morning came, I did something I had done my whole life, without ever examining why. I made myself small. I told my formal party to meet me inside at 0800 hours. Then I came early, alone, on foot, in a plain gray civilian coat with nothing on it, no stars, no insignia, no sign of who I was. I told myself I wanted 10 quiet minutes with the building before it turned me into a title. That was true. What was also true, and what I did not admit until later, was that arriving invisible was simply the most comfortable way I knew how to arrive anywhere. A woman in a gray coat owes no one an explanation. A woman with 4 stars on her shoulders is a fact that other people have to react to. And I had spent my entire life avoiding being a fact that other people had to react to. The river entrance was busy that morning because of a visiting delegation. There were cameras somewhere and a lot of people in good suits and a cordon of security along the steps. I started up them with my hands in my coat pockets, one more anonymous woman in gray, thinking about nothing more important than the cold and the coffee I had not finished. Off to the side, near the top, I saw a man I recognized instantly, even after all this time. Preston. My brother, in a contractor's badge and a nice suit, there for some meeting about some software. He saw me too. And for 1 second, our eyes met, and then he looked away and pretended he had not, half embarrassed to be caught noticing his basement clerk sister at his important building. I felt the old small feeling settle over me like a familiar coat, and I kept climbing. That was when the young Marine stepped into my path. He was maybe 24, a sergeant, sharp in his uniform and sharper in his own mind, pulling access control duty on a morning with brass and cameras and every reason to want to look decisive. His name, I would learn, was Colton Rhodes. He put a hand up toward me and told me to move. He said the steps were closed, that it was VIPs only this morning, and he called me lady in the way that turns the word into a shove before any hand is ever raised. I have been spoken to by dictators and hostage takers and men who genuinely wanted me dead, and I have learned that the only power you keep in those moments is the power to stay calm. So I stayed calm. I told him, evenly, that I had business inside and that I would step around. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach for a badge or a name or a rank. I simply moved to go around him the way you step around anyone standing in a doorway. I remember thinking, with a kind of tired amusement, that this was the most fitting possible way to arrive. Unrecognized, waved off, told I did not belong in the building I had given my life to. He backhanded me. I do not think he meant it to land the way it did. I think he meant to make a show of moving me, to look strong for the delegation, to put his arm across a slow civilian woman and sweep her aside. But his forearm caught my shoulder and the side of my arm hard, harder than he understood his own strength, and I was on a stone step in a coat with my hands still in my pockets, and I went down. The steps came up fast. I remember the gray of them in the cold and the strange, slow silence, as the whole entrance seemed to inhale at once. That particular quiet that falls when a crowd of people all realize at the same instant that something has gone wrong. I had imagined 100 ways of walking into that building. None of them started with the ground. I did not hit the pavement. A hand closed around my arm, strong and certain, and stopped my fall a foot from the stone. I looked up. A man in a 3-star service uniform had come off the top of the steps at a dead run and caught me, and I knew his face before I knew his name in my mouth. Elias Ward. A decade ago, he had been a lieutenant colonel under my command in a very bad stretch overseas, a stretch where I had refused a plan that would have gotten his people killed and taken the professional risk onto myself instead. And now he wore 3 stars of his own, and he was holding my arm on the Pentagon steps with an expression I can only describe as fury held on a very short leash. He steadied me until he was sure my feet were under me. Then he turned to Sergeant Rhodes, and in a voice that did not need to be loud to stop everything, he said 3 words. "You're finished, Marine." The young man's face changed as the words reached him, the confidence draining out of it, replaced by the dawning understanding that whoever this woman in the gray coat was, he had just made the worst mistake of his short life in front of the worst possible witness. Ward was not done. He looked back down at me, made sure again that I was steady, and then said, for the whole cordon and every camera and every person in a good suit to hear, "This is Lieutenant General Vance. Get her people, now." 20 feet away, at the top of the steps, my brother Preston stood absolutely still, the color draining out of his face, hearing the name he shared and the rank he had spent 30 years insisting I could never hold, watching a 3-star general study his sister with the care you would give a legend, and finally, seeing me. They brought me inside through a side door and put me in a small, quiet office off the main corridor while the building rearranged itself around what had just happened. A medic checked my wrist and my shoulder and pronounced me bruised but sound. I sat in a chair that was too soft and watched people move past the doorway with the particular urgency of an institution that has just realized it made a very large mistake in public, in front of cameras, to a woman it had summoned to promote. Elias Ward would not leave the door. He stood there like a sentry, apologizing in low, clipped sentences that a Marine in his building had put hands on me, that he would personally see it handled. That of all the people in the world for this to happen to. I told him to stop. I told him the young man was not the real problem. He looked at me like I had spoken a foreign language, because from where he stood, the problem was obvious, and it was wearing a Marine sergeant's stripes. I tried to explain it, though I was still finding the words myself. I said that a scared kid making a terrible choice to look strong was a fixable thing, an ordinary human failure the Army knew how to correct. What was not ordinary, I said, was that I had chosen to arrive at the most important morning of my career dressed as a nobody, on purpose, because 30 years had taught me that being seen was more dangerous than being knocked down. The shove was his mistake. The gray coat was mine. And it was the coat I could not stop thinking about, sitting in that soft chair with a bruise blooming under my sleeve. A young lieutenant I did not know put his head in the door and asked, very nervously, if there was anything I needed, anything at all, and I understood from his face that word had already traveled the length of the building, that the story of the woman on the steps was now moving faster than any of us could steer it. I told him I was fine and that he should carry on. He hesitated, then said that it was an honor to have me in the building, that people had been talking about the classified work for years without knowing whose it was, and now they knew. I thanked him. When he left, I sat with the strangeness of it, the fact that the same morning had made me both visible and vulnerable in the same instant, that the two things I had spent my life keeping apart had finally arrived together, whether I wanted them to or not. Renata arrived like a weather front. She had heard within minutes the way she heard everything, and she came through the door, ready to burn the building to its foundation. She told me to say the word, and that sergeant would be out of the Corps by nightfall. I looked at my captain, at the loyalty in her that I did not deserve and had somehow earned anyway. And I told her that was exactly the word I was not going to say. Not yet. Maybe not at all. She stared at me. She said, "Ma'am, he knocked you down the Pentagon steps." I said, "I know, Renata, I was there." And then I said the thing that surprised us both, which was that the fall was not the part of the morning that had hurt me. She did not understand, and I loved her for being angry on my behalf. But I needed her to hold the anger a little longer so I could think. Because sitting in that soft chair, I was not thinking about Colton Rhodes at all. I was thinking about an empty chair at a wedding in 2008. I was thinking about a text I deleted that said, "You have no idea." I was thinking about a star I pinned on alone and a story about a basement in Virginia that had been handed down to children like an heirloom. For 30 years, I had let my own family keep a smaller version of me because it was cheaper than the argument, and on those steps, in that fall, I had finally seen the price of buying quiet for that long. The Marine had only knocked me down once. I had been knocking myself down for 3 decades, one gray coat at a time. Ward said something then that I have not forgotten. He said he had served under me in 2016, and that a great many people who were alive in his old unit were alive because of decisions I had made, and that he was sorry the first thing this building did when I came to be honored was knock me to the ground. He said it plainly, a soldier stating a fact, and it undid something in me that 30 years of family dinners had tied very tight. To be seen like that, without having to ask for it, without having to prove anything, was so unfamiliar that for a moment I did not know how to hold my face. I sat with that for a while, turning it over. All my life I had believed that the quiet was a kind of strength, that a woman who did not need to be seen was harder to wound than a woman who did. And there was some truth in it. But sitting in that office with a bruise on my arm, I finally saw the other half. The quiet had not made me unwoundable. It had only made me easy to overlook, and being easy to overlook is not the same as being at peace. I had confused the absence of applause with the absence of need, and they are not the same. A person can go 30 years without a single person asking how her day was and call it discipline, and be starving the whole time and never once let herself feel the hunger, because feeling it would mean admitting the arrangement had a cost. I had felt the cost on the steps. There was no unfeeling it now. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was Preston. The message read, "Was that really you? Are you okay?" I looked at it for a long moment. Then I turned the phone face down on the desk. Not out of cruelty, not to punish him. I turned it over because for the first time in my life, this moment was mine, entirely mine, and I was not ready to hand any part of it back to the family that had spent so long deciding what my moments were allowed to mean. Anger would have been easy. Clarity was the harder, better thing, and I wanted to give it room to arrive before I answered anyone about anything. By the next morning, I had made 2 decisions, and they were both about refusing the thing I had done my whole life, which was to make myself smaller so that other people could stay comfortable. The first decision came when a very senior officer, a good man trying to protect me, suggested we handle the steps incident discreetly. He meant well. He said a public conduct review could complicate the confirmation, that a quiet administrative fix would spare me the spectacle, that no one would blame me for wanting it to simply disappear. And I understood him completely because quiet was my whole life. Quiet was the language I was fluent in. Quiet was what let a 30-year-old story about a basement in Virginia calcify into fact. I told him no. I told him the incident would go through proper conduct review, on the record, in the daylight, exactly as it would for any soldier of any rank who was struck down on those steps. If a private had been knocked to the ground by a sergeant, I said, we would not be having a conversation about discretion. Quiet, I said, was what had let it happen in the first place, and I was done buying quiet at any price. He nodded slowly, and I think he understood he was watching something in me change in real time, 30 years late, but changing all the same. Colton Rhodes was pulled from duty pending the review. His chain of command braced for the worst, because the worst was what everyone expected, when a 3-star was knocked to the ground by a sergeant in front of cameras. I asked for his file, not to build a case against him. I wanted to understand him, because I have never in my life been able to end a person I did not first try to understand, and I was not going to start with a 24-year-old. The second decision walked into my hotel that evening in the form of my brother. Preston stood in the hallway outside my door, and he looked older than he had that morning, and smaller, which was a strange thing to witness in a man who had spent his life taking up all the space in every room. I let him in. What followed was not a screaming match. It was 30 years surfacing quietly in one restrained conversation, which is far harder to survive than shouting, because you cannot hide inside the noise. He asked me why I had never just told him. And I told him the truth. I said I had told him. Every promotion I never announced, every deployment I could not explain, every empty chair at every event, that was me telling him who I was in the only language I had. He had simply decided over and over what all of it meant. And what it meant was always something that let him stay the expert and kept me in the basement. I had not hidden from him. He had refused to look, and there is a difference. And the difference is the whole 30 years. He said he was sorry. I believed that he was. But I told him I did not need an apology. And I meant it. What I needed, I said, was for him to stop narrating my life to his children. I told him I would not be the family's small story anymore. And I would not pretend the last 30 years had not happened just to make the next reunion tidy. A boundary, I have come to understand, is not a punishment. It is a map of where I end and someone else's assumptions begin. I drew the map for him plainly, and then I left the door open, because a boundary is not the same thing as a wall, and I did not want a wall. I wanted a brother who knew my name meant what it said. He stood in that hallway, holding a business card I had given him, a plain card that read Lieutenant General M. Vance, and I watched him read it over and over as though the letters might rearrange themselves into the sister he thought he had. He told me very quietly that he had spent his whole life being the family's authority on everything except his own sister. It was the truest thing he had ever said to me. I did not rush to comfort him. Some truths need to be stood in for a while before anyone reaches for a blanket, and I had stood in mine for 30 years. He could stand in his for one evening. The consequences spread outward from those steps, the way cracks spread across glass, slowly and then all at once. And I found myself in the strange position of watching two very different men reckon with the same thing, which was the distance between the story they had told and the truth they had refused to see. At Preston's house, his teenage son asked him a simple, devastating question. He asked why his father had always said Aunt Meredith had a boring desk job when there were now articles calling her one of the most significant officers of her generation. Preston did not have an answer. Danielle told me about it later, and she also told me something she had never said out loud in 20 years of marriage. She said she had always known I was more than the family let me be, and that she had simply let her husband talk. She was not proud of it. I did not need her to be. I only needed someone in that house to finally say the quiet part where the children could hear it, so that the inheritance stopped with them. The conduct review convened, and I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I attended. Colton Rhodes sat at the front of that room, expecting the general he had knocked down to end his career with a single sentence, and he was so frightened that his hands shook on the table in front of him. I did not want his fear. Fear is easy to produce and worth nothing. I asked him one question. I asked him why. His answer was not the answer of a monster. It was the answer of a scared young man who had joined the Corps to become someone, and had spent every day since terrified that the people above him would discover he did not belong. He told me he thought if he was hard enough, loud enough, decisive enough, no one would ever see the kid underneath who was sure he was a fraud. He said he saw a slow civilian woman in a gray coat in his way on the most visible morning of his short career. and he made her into a prop for looking strong, and he had been sick to his stomach every hour since. He said he did not know who I was, and that it should not have mattered who I was, that he should not have put a hand on anyone that way, regardless. It did not excuse what he did. I want to be clear about that because mercy and excuse are not the same thing, and I have watched too many people confuse them. But I knew that feeling he described better than he could imagine. I had just spent 30 years hiding the exact opposite secret, terrified that if anyone saw how much I had done, I would owe them something, or lose the quiet I had built, or become a fact people had to react to. He was hiding that he was less than he appeared. I was hiding that I was more. We were both, in our own ways, climbing stairs in a coat, hoping no one would notice us, and both of us had gotten a stranger hurt because of it. In his case, the stranger was me. In mine, it was only ever myself. Something shifted in me during those weeks, and it was not about him. It was about me. When Elias Ward asked, carefully, whether I would allow him to introduce me properly at the confirmation events, to say my name and my record out loud in front of people, my whole body wanted to say no, to stay in the gray coat, to slip in the side door. Instead, I said yes. For the first time in my life, I agreed to stop arriving invisible. The family group chat, which for years had been a place where I was talked about rather than talked to, had gone quiet as the truth spread through it. The silence was not triumph. It was the sound of a story being rewritten, one stunned relative at a time, and I let it happen without saying a word because the truth did not need my help anymore. It only needed the room. When the review turned to what should be done with Sergeant Rhodes, the room expected me to bring down the full weight of my rank, and I understood the temptation better than anyone in that room. But I had spent 30 years being written off by people who never bothered to look closer, and I knew, in my bones, exactly what it cost to be reduced to the worst or smallest version of yourself and then discarded. I was not going to do that to a 24-year-old who could still become something better, no matter how badly he had begun. I gave my recommendation to the board plainly. I recommended against a discharge that would end him. I recommended instead a formal reprimand, on his record where it belonged, paired with remedial conduct and leadership training, on the strict condition that he earn his way back through the work. Accountability, not destruction. Elias Ward, who loves me and who had wanted to see the young man crushed on my behalf, said afterward that most generals would have ended him. I told him that most generals had never been underestimated for 30 years. I knew what it cost to be written off, and I would not spend the first hours of my new visibility doing to a scared kid the exact thing that had been done to me. Respect you demand, I told Ward, is just fear wearing a uniform, and I have never once been interested in that. The only respect worth anything is the kind that arrives on its own, when the truth finally stands up in the room and speaks for itself. I had waited 30 years for mine. I was not going to deny a young man the chance to actually earn his, the hard and honest way, rather than fake it with a raised voice on a set of steps. Ward looked at me for a long moment, and then he said that he had followed me for a decade and still managed to underestimate me, and that he was done doing that. I told him that made two of us who were finally done. I heard later about the shape those weeks took for him. His remediation was not gentle. He spent his mornings before dawn with a senior non-commissioned officer who had no patience for excuses and had been briefed on exactly what he had done. He spent his afternoons studying the things a leader is supposed to know about the weight of his own hands and the people below him who cannot answer back. He was made to sit with the fact that if the woman on those steps had been an ordinary civilian with no general to catch her arm, there would have been no cameras, no review, no consequence at all, only a bruised stranger and a young man who never learned. That, more than anything, was the lesson they drove into him, and by every account, it landed. A man who is only sorry he got caught stays the same man. A man who is sorry for what he would have done even if no one had been watching is becoming a different one. They watched to see which he would be. Rhodes was stunned when they told him. He had walked in expecting the axe and walked out holding a future he did not think he deserved, contingent entirely on whether he was willing to do the work of becoming worthy of it. His remediation began with a written apology to me that he was required to actually mean, and when it came, 3 careful, handwritten pages, I could tell that he had meant it. It was not polished. It was honest. Honest was what I wanted. He wrote that he had spent his whole enlistment afraid, and that being caught, being seen at his worst, had somehow made him less afraid, not more, and he did not fully understand why. I understood why. Being seen is the thing we are all most afraid of and most starved for at the same time. With Preston, I did not offer instant forgiveness, because instant forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, not the other person, a way of skipping the hard part so you can feel resolved and go back to your life. He asked whether he could attend my confirmation. I told him yes, on one condition. He had to tell his children the truth first, the real version. Out loud, at his own kitchen table, before he sat in any ceremony celebrating the sister he had spent their whole lives shrinking. He did it. Danielle told me about that too. She told me he sat his kids down and said that he had been wrong about their aunt for 30 years, that I was not a clerk in a basement, that I was one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire army, and that he had been too proud and too frightened of feeling small to ever say it. His voice, she said, was unsteady the whole time. When he finished, his son asked him why it had taken so long. Preston said he did not have a good answer, only a true one, which was that it is easier to keep telling an old story than to admit you have been the one telling it wrong. And then, for the first time in our lives, my brother and I had a conversation as two adults instead of as a script. He asked me carefully what I actually did. Not the classified parts, which I still could not give him, but the shape of it, the size of it, the weight of the decisions. And I told him what I could. I watched his face as he understood, for the first time, that the sister he had reduced to a punchline had spent decades carrying things he could not have carried for a single week. He did not get defensive. He did not try to make himself the expert again. He just listened, the way I had wanted someone in that family to listen for 30 years. And at the end of it, he said, very quietly, that he was ashamed and that he was also, underneath the shame, proud in a way he had never let himself be. I told him he was allowed to be both. Most true things come in pairs. He asked what he could do. I told him the truth, which was that there was nothing to fix and nothing to buy back, that the 30 years were spent and gone. But there was still the rest of it, however much rest there was, and he could spend that part actually knowing me. He could ask about my day and mean it, and then he could stop editing me down to a size that fit his comfort. That, I said, was not a punishment or a penance. It was just an invitation to have a sister he had never bothered to meet. Not everything was healed. 30 years does not close in a single evening, and I did not pretend it had. But we talked, actually talked, and it was a beginning, and beginnings were more than we had managed in decades. The confirmation was set for a morning a few weeks later, and in the days before it, I found that the hard part was not the ceremony. The hard part was the thing the ceremony would ask of me, which was to walk in as myself, fully seen, and not flinch. 30 years of practice at being small does not undo itself just because you decide it should. Habits that old have their own gravity. The evening before, Renata helped me prepare, laying out the uniform, checking the placement of every ribbon, quietly making sure the woman who had climbed those steps in a gray coat did not try to sneak into her own confirmation. At one point she stopped and looked at me and said something that landed harder than she knew. She said I had spent my whole career making sure other people got seen. Every soldier I ever mentored. Every name I ever put forward for an award. Every young officer I ever pulled aside to tell that they were better than they believed. And she asked whether I might, just this once, be allowed to take a turn. I did not have an answer for her. I only knew that the hardest order I had ever given in 30 years of giving orders was the one I was giving myself now, which was to stop hiding. Ward came by to brief me on a few things, and near the end he mentioned that Colton Rhodes had completed the first phase of his remediation and had asked, through the proper channels, whether he might be permitted to attend the confirmation, not to be forgiven in public, just to stand at the back and see it done right, to watch the woman he had knocked down be raised up as a kind of penance and a kind of lesson he wanted to carry. I told Ward I would think about it. I found, to my own surprise, that I wanted to say yes, and I sat with that surprise for a while, because a month earlier I would not have recognized the woman who wanted it. I did decide, in the end, to let him come. I told Ward yes. It was not a soft decision, and it was not about the young man's comfort. It was about the difference between a lesson learned in private and a lesson lived in public. and I had just spent 30 years learning what a lesson lived only in private is worth, which is very little to anyone but yourself. If he stood at the back of that hall and watched the woman he had knocked down receive what she had earned, and if that image stayed lodged in him for the rest of his career, then it would do more good in the world than his discharge ever could have. Mercy is not the same as leniency. Leniency lets a thing slide. Mercy makes a person carry the full weight of what they did and then trusts them to do something better with it. I was betting on the second, and I have never been a reckless gambler. That same evening, Preston sent me a photograph. It was his kids at the kitchen table and a short note that said they wanted to watch their aunt get her 4th star, that they were proud, and that they were sorry it had taken them so long to know they should be. I looked at that picture for a long time. The false story about me, the one that had been handed down to those children like a family recipe, was being replaced in real time by the truth. And it was those same children asking to witness it. I sat alone that night with 3 stars on the table in front of me and a 4th in a small open box beside them. And I understood that I had spent my whole life confusing being humble with being hidden. They are not the same thing. Humility is knowing your size. Hiding is refusing to let anyone else know it. I had done the second for 30 years and called it the first, and the mislabeling had cost me a family or nearly. I laid the gray coat over the back of a chair that night and looked at it for a while. It was a good coat. It had done its job faithfully for a long time, which was to let me move through the world unremarked, to keep me safe from the risk of being a fact that other people had to react to. I did not hate it. But I understood finally that safety and smallness had become the same garment, and that I could not keep one without the other. I hung it in the closet, and I did not throw it away, because the point was never to destroy the old version of me. The point was to stop wearing her. I closed the box on the single new star and decided, finally and completely, that I would walk in the front door of my own life as myself, and that whatever it cost me in comfort, it would cost me less than another 30 years in a gray coat. The ceremony was held in a proper military hall with the flags and the polished floor and the quiet gravity that these things carry when they are done right. Elias Ward presided. And this time, I did not arrive in a gray coat through a side door, hoping no one would notice. I walked in as myself, in full uniform, my record read aloud without apology, 3 stars on my shoulders about to become 4, and I did not look at the floor once. In the front row sat my family. Not an empty chair this time. A full row. Preston and Danielle and their 2 kids. All of them watching me the way you watch someone you are seeing clearly for the first time. Preston's face was not performing anything. There was no expertise in it, no bit he was doing for a table, no line about legends and paper pushers waiting behind his teeth. There was just my little brother, finally looking at his sister and seeing her whole, and the sight of it closed a wound so old I had stopped noticing it was open. At the back of the hall, in a crisp dress uniform, stood Colton Rhodes. I had said yes. When the ceremony reached its moment and I passed near him on my way to the front, he came to attention and rendered a salute that was correct and humble and entirely earned. The salute of a young man who had knocked me to the ground and then done the hard work of understanding why that was unforgivable and how to become someone who never would again. I returned it. We did not speak. We did not need to. The boy who had shoved me down the steps stood at attention and watched me rise, changed by the mercy I had chosen instead of the vengeance I could have taken. And that exchange said everything either of us would ever need to say to each other. I thought, in that moment, about the 11-year-old under the station wagon, listening to applause through a screen door and deciding it did not matter. I wanted to tell her that it had mattered, that it was allowed to matter, that wanting to be seen is not weakness or vanity. It is just the ordinary hunger of being a person. I could not tell her anything. But I could stop making her carry the old bargain forward. I could let this room see me and not flinch from it, and in that way, I could finally give the girl in the driveway the one thing no one on that porch had ever thought to give her, which was a witness. They pinned the 4th star on my shoulder in that hall, in front of the people who once kept a smaller version of me on a shelf, and it was not revenge, and it was not triumph over anyone. It was relief. It was the deep, quiet exhale of a woman who no longer had to hold her breath, who no longer had to choose between being loved and being known. Afterward, in the reception, Preston found me. He did not have a speech, which for my brother was its own kind of miracle. He just stood in front of me and said that he did not have anything prepared, that he had finally run out of the words he used to hide behind, and that he simply, finally saw me. He said he was proud and that he was sorry it had taken a shove on a set of steps to open his eyes. I let that be enough for today. Not because everything was fixed, but because you do not have to finish healing to start, and starting after 30 years felt like its own kind of arrival. I went home that night to my own quiet apartment, and I set the 4th star on the kitchen counter under the lamp, and I stood there in the warm light with no ache where the old one used to live. 30 years of being small on purpose, and it had taken a stranger's backhand and a friend's caught arm and a brother's undone face to teach me the simplest thing. The thing I had known how to give everyone else and never once given myself. So let me say it to you, wherever you are, whoever has kept you on a shelf. If the people who love you have decided on a smaller version of you and set it somewhere they can reach without stretching, you do not have to smash it to be free. You do not have to shout or prove or knock anyone down or wait 30 years for a stranger to do it for you. You just have to stop climbing the stairs in a plain gray coat, hoping no one will notice you. Take off the coat, walk in as yourself through the front door in the daylight. The right people will already be standing. That morning on the steps changed something in me that 30 years of family dinners never could, and it wasn't about the fall. It was about finally letting myself be seen. If you've ever kept yourself small so the people around you could stay comfortable, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Do you think I was right to choose remedial training for that young Marine instead of ending his career? And would you have turned your phone face down on your brother or answered him right away? Tell me. I read every comment. If this story reached something in you, hit subscribe and stay a while.